I'm here with Dr. Brendan Rigby, Manager of Integration and Evidence within the Performance Division of the Department of Education and Training, Victoria. Thanks a lot, Brendan, for the time for this conversation today. Brendan, can you please tell me a bit more about yourself and your role within the Department of Education and Training?
Sure. Thanks again for having me, Babak, and good morning. So I work within a division called Performance Division, and it's fairly innocuous sounding. And what we actually do, we have three branches within our division. So probably about 100 staff members across the three branches. So we're quite a large division, and we work in partnerships with regions and with areas to drive school improvement and teacher professional practice with the ultimate outcomes to improve students' learning achievement, well-being, and engagement. So across those three branches, we sit in a branch called Improvement and Accountability, which has stewardship for the Framework for Improving Student Outcomes, affectionately known as FISO. And then within that branch, there's 5 teams, and the team that I lead is called Integration and Evidence. And we have that direct stewardship over FISO, but we come at it from a very much research and evidence informed perspective. So what we're trying to do, what we do is generate data, evidence, and insights about schools' implementation of FISO, and we use that then to feed back into our colleagues who work in the policy space. We use it to feed back into our regional colleagues and our regional leaders who work directly in providing that differentiated and targeted support to schools. And we also feed it back to schools themselves, to school leaders, to middle leaders, to teachers, to help them improve how they're planning and monitoring their implementation of FISO.
All right, excellent. Thanks, Brendan. My next question is about FISO, and if you could explain a bit more about the framework, given that you have been heavily involved in its development and revision, and also if you could just talk a little bit about the reasons behind its development.
Yeah, sure. So FISO was developed and launched in 2015 as part of the Education State Reform and Reform Initiatives, I should say. And what one of the key roles, I think, of government and particularly this department is in education is to really ensure that we're providing and promoting evidence-informed practice. So that includes both teaching practice, leadership practice, and that we're also facilitating the sharing of that practice across our system between schools and across schools. So in order to do that, what Victoria needed at that time was a common framework. So we didn't necessarily have a common school improvement framework and a common school improvement language that would enable that sharing of practice, that sharing of knowledge, and that sharing of what we know is working and how we can make it work better. So that's where FISO came in to provide that common language and that common framework for all Victorian government schools to use to enable that collaboration, enable that sharing and that knowledge exchange, both within schools themselves and across schools. So if that's the rationale for why FISO was needed, then the kind of problem that we're trying to address then implicit within that is of a system where there was probably more characterized as one of fragmentation than coherence. So, a lot of schools doing really great work and really meeting the needs of their communities and their students within their contexts. And some schools perhaps not performing as well as they could, but it was very much fragmented and the system wasn't joined up. It wasn't coherent. And what we know from research of education jurisdictions that perform really well is that you have high levels of collaboration, high levels of trust, high levels of collective responsibility, both within schools and across schools. So if you're trying to build that, if you're trying to enable that, that sort of culture at the system level, you need a common framework within which to do it. So I guess that was the kind of problem that we're trying to address with FISO at that point in time. In terms of the nuts and bolts of FISO, you may already be aware of this, but it has those 4 priority areas, with excellence in teaching and learning visually being the most dominant area on top, and then supported and underpinned by those 3 areas underneath. So positive climate for learning, professional leadership, and community engagement in learning. And within each priority, you've got 4 dimensions. And then within each dimension, you've got a number of different practice descriptors. And these descriptors are really what we're trying to drive at in terms of practice. I talked about evidence-informed practice, and that practice is actually really found in those descriptors when you kind of get into it. And when schools get into it, it describes, what are those practices that you would expect to see in a school that does those things really well. And to help schools get there, those descriptors are defined against a continua. And so that's the FISO continua of practice. So as part of their annual planning every year, schools will do a self-evaluation against the continua and define where they see themselves on that continua, with the goal to try and identify, what are the practices we really want to focus on as a school to meet the needs of our students, and what does good practice look like? Where are we trying to get to as well? If we're here, how do we get to here? There's also then against that, we've got improvement measures. So the FISO improvement measures is also part of the framework, and that is making that connection between practice and then performance. So these are the practices that you expect to see your teachers doing, your students doing, your leaders doing. Well, how does that match up against performance? What are the changes in student performance or teacher performance you'd expect to see as a result of that? So we use statewide common measures that are available to all schools. So obviously that includes NAPLAN, but it also includes some survey instruments that schools use every year. So the school staff survey, which schools undertake once a year, the Attitudes to School survey, which is a student perception survey, again, that schools undertake each year. There's also a parent opinion survey that parents can opt into to do each year as well. And there are kind of key performance measures that we match up to the practices based on what we see in the data that's telling us, okay, if you're seeing improvement in these practices or improvement in these performance measures, what's the corresponding practice or performance change you'd expect to see as well, so that schools can use those as indicators. And then the kind of last piece of FISO is the improvement cycle. So I think in all that, what we're getting to then is, I think, trying to strike that balance. I think that all education jurisdictions try and do when it comes to school improvement policy, between ensuring that schools own their improvement journey and the improvement process, and that part of that ownership is about a commitment to continuously learning as an organization, as a school community, but then also the other driver, which is accountability. And how can we support holding schools accountable, but also how can we help schools become internally accountable, and accountable in the sense that you're accountable and that we are all accountable for the learning and well-being of our students. And so how can you kind of strike a balance between those two things, which are, I think, always constantly in tension, and that we're trying to find some way through.
And when it comes to the take-up or the implementation of the FISO framework, are schools required to report back to the department, or is this something for internal use and observation for schools?
There's a couple of mechanisms, both internal and external. So FISO is operationalized through the school improvement processes that we have in Victoria. So for example, one of those ways is through school review. So it's a legislative requirement that all schools have a 4-year strategic plan. But in order to create the plan, a school will go through a review process first. And that review process is very much about improvement and about the school's improvement. And as part of that review process, we have a number of contracts with review partners So, for example, Monash University is a review partner, and they have a number of reviewers that they contract to and that we work with. And so if a school has a review, it means that they've come to the end of their 4-year strategic plan and they need to develop a new plan. And so the reviewer will form a panel, and the panel normally has the regional leader who supports that school as a challenge partner and kind of external expert. It will also have 2 challenge partners as well. And this could be a principal from another school. It could be an expert from Melbourne University. It could be someone from central office in the department. It could be me. I've been a challenge partner twice, and they make the panel, and they'll come and work with the school to develop essentially almost like a very accelerated action research project, where they'll develop some terms of reference, some key research questions that they want to explore with the school, and then a bit of a methodology for how they'll answer those research questions. And then at the end of that process, which is usually about 3 days in total, sometimes longer, the reviewer and the review panel will produce key directions that they submit to the school, which will be framed around, here are what the review panel's recommendations are in terms of what your next 4-year goals should be, your 4-year targets, and your 4-year key improvement strategies. And then it'll be up to the school to then take that forward, take it to their school community, take it to their school council, and create and endorse that new 4-year plan. So where FISO comes into that is that, so for example, as part of that review process, schools will self-evaluate against FISO. So again, we're really trying to build in that sense of ownership and wanting schools to take ownership of the review process by starting with self-evaluation and starting with the data, the observations, the evidence that you can draw from your community to inform the process. And then the review panel will also validate that self-evaluation. So they'll use FISO as well and look at how the school has self-evaluated and agree or disagree with it based on what evidence they see as well and what evidence the school has presented. That's one way. Another way is that the key improvement strategies, the 4-year key improvement strategies that each school has as part of their 4-year plan, those are directly aligned to FISO and should either come out of FISO or be really closely aligned to FISO. So a school, for example, might have an improvement strategy that is seeking over a 4-year period to embed a consistent instructional model across the school for all staff. And that will be aligned to a particular FISO dimension. So that's kind of a couple of ways. So it's a little bit, to your question, Vivek, it's a little bit internal in that, we want the school to own and do that process and make use of FISO, but it's also externally from the department's point of view, we operationalize FISO through the school review process. So, schools are mandated to use FISO as part of the process. And the department from our end, we may look at, for example, those self-evaluation results, but we look at it from a learning point of view to try and understand, okay, how are schools self-evaluating against FISO, and what can we learn from that, not from a more kind of strict accountability point of view.
Yeah, sure. And as you said, Brendan, one of the main reasons behind the development of FISO was bringing a bit of a consistency when it comes to school improvement efforts. And I've had quite a bit of look at the FISO framework, and what I've seen is this idea of excellence and improvement keeps repeating in the document. And I'm just curious to know what are these terms meant when they're used in this context of development, what is meant by excellence and what is meant by improvement, how they're conceptualized and also how they're measured.
So the department's conceptualization of improvement probably takes into account a couple of broad movements, which you might are probably already familiar with and which your students might be familiar with in the literature. And those are, school effectiveness, school improvement, and schools as learning organizations. So, school effectiveness is that particular movement where it's really focusing in on those, what are the in-school factors which the evidence suggests directly supports student learning outcomes. So, high expectations, safe and orderly environment, evidence-based teaching strategies. School improvement is a little bit more broader than that in terms of taking into account organizational design, your school culture, your school values, the workforce, and other factors both within and outside of schools, where the purpose is to bring people together around that common goal of improving students' outcomes, but one as well where we acknowledge and we better understand that in order to achieve that goal, school improvement is also characterized then by trust. Trust amongst staff, trust between parents, teachers, and students. It's also characterized by collective responsibility for all students, that all staff have that responsibility they feel, and also characterized by collaboration. So it's a kind of it's conceptualized school improvement drawing on both of those two movements. And then the third one I mentioned as well, it kind of draws on the notion of schools as learning organizations. So capturing that concept that schools are organizations that can continuously improve. If they use particular cycles of inquiry, so we have our FISO improvement cycle, but there's lots of different cycles out there. As there's the PDSA, there's Helen Timperley's spirals of inquiry, there's Simon Breakspear's teaching sprints. There's lots of different cycles, but all kind of coming back to that notion that if you follow these cycles at different levels in your school, at the classroom level, at the professional learning community level, at the whole school level, you can continuously improve your practices and therefore continuously improve the outcomes that students succeed in. So I guess broadly speaking, that's our concept of improvement, drawing on those three things. And then when it comes to excellence, probably a little bit more defined by what we mean by excellence. And it's very much conceptualized in the notion that all students can be supported to achieve to the potential they're capable of. So, it doesn't matter where the student's starting point is. It acknowledges that all students are at different points in their learning journey, and that they'll also, achieve to different points in their learning journey. And it's not all the same for all students, and they're not all going to achieve right to the same level necessarily, but that it's acknowledged, and we have those expectations that all students can achieve to the potential that they're capable of.
Sure. And also, Brendan, in terms of the take-up and implementation of the framework, if you might have any observation how the framework might have been taken up in different school contexts. And I'm particularly interested to hear from you in terms of how some perhaps more socioeconomically disadvantaged schools have enacted and acted on FISO. That would be very helpful.
Yeah, sure. So to give you a sense of how we know what we know in terms of what I'm about to tell you. So we commissioned an evaluation of FISO from 2015 to 2018. So we have that evaluation of it, which was very formative or in nature. And then since 2018, the kind of key responsibility of my team has been doing that ongoing monitoring of FISO's implementation and generating that data and evidence. So that's kind of where I'm drawing my response from. So the key finding out of the FISO evaluation was very much that it had been taken up by essentially all schools and adapted as the school improvement framework that they were using. And this was across geographic areas, across socioeconomic contexts, across. I might just wait for the plane to. Thanks. I'm just going to wait for the plane to pass.
Sorry, that was on my side.
No, all good. I'll just start again. So what we learned from the FISO evaluation was that by 2018, FISO had been taken up by all schools, and it was the common and consistent language and framework of school improvement. And then what we've been then noticing since then is just drilling down into some different parts of FISO. So for example, we've been drilling down and looking at the self-evaluation that schools do and trying to understand, well, how are schools self-evaluating? what are the trends we're seeing? Is there a relationship to student performance between where schools self-evaluate and the learning achievement that their students achieve? In terms of socioeconomic context and factors, there's some things that we notice which probably aren't surprising given what we already know from the research. So for example, when it comes to self-evaluation, schools that are in lower SFOE, lower socioeconomic, have lower SFOE, so they're more advantaged, they self-evaluate higher than schools that are in high SFOE or who are more socioeconomically disadvantaged. We also noticed that in terms of the improvement strategies that schools are selecting in their 4-year plans, I talked through the school review process and how they create these 4-year improvement strategies. So we also noticed that the theme and the nature of those improvement strategies are different for schools in high SFOE. So schools that are in more socioeconomically disadvantaged areas are picking strategies and choosing strategies that are quite different to those schools that are in the low SFOE or in the more socioeconomically advantaged areas, for example. So you might see schools in the high SFOE focus more on strategies such as whole school approaches to embedding an instructional model across their teaching staff, or focus more on their leadership practice, or more on creating those kind of safe and all learning environments. Kind of like what we'd see from the literature, focusing more on the building blocks and the foundations of school improvement. Whereas those schools in low SFOE are able to focus on other aspects of school improvement, such as student well-being and relationships between students and teachers, for example. And they might also focus less actually on building capabilities around data and evidence. I think to one of your original questions that we discussed, Babak, there's an interesting thing where the schools in those higher SFOE areas are focusing more on building teachers' capabilities in data and assessment. And so we're just trying to understand, well, then what does this actually mean? Like we're seeing these clear relationships, but what does that actually mean for those schools in socioeconomically disadvantaged areas, and about what are the resources that are afforded to them? What are the challenges that they're facing that are a bit different? And then how can we support those schools in a different way to the schools that are in more socioeconomically advantaged areas?
Yeah, and I think that's really would be very interesting to see how different schools' priorities might sort of influence the way they take up like a comprehensive policy such as FISO, and that how that data that is generated could help perhaps feed back more tailored forms of support and resources for those schools. Brendan, this brings me to the very last question, and I know that FISO is a quite comprehensive framework. A lot of work has gone into its development, and also the framework identifies a number of different goals and priorities. One of them is health and well-being, but also FISO talks quite a bit around performance and outcomes. And based on the work that you have been leading in the development and implementation and overseeing the evaluation of the framework, have you noticed any tensions between these different aims and goals within the policy framework?
I think that the tension has been, I'll talk to the health and well-being part a little bit more precisely, but I'll just park that for the time being. But in terms of, more broadly between practice and performance, because FISO itself is very much focused as a model and as a framework on practice. I described to you, we have those improvement measures that sit alongside and within the model, but certainly, any kind of glance at FISO and a reading of it, you'll see that it's very much focused on helping schools improve their practice. So there is a tension there because, kind of, it doesn't need to be said, but it's useful to remind ourselves is that, education and schooling is a very complex phenomenon, and trying to unpack and understand the relationship between practice and performance is really messy. It's not clear, and we've done a lot of work to try and understand it better, particularly using FISO as our frame and looking at self-evaluation, looking at key improvement strategies and trying to understand, well, are certain schools doing different things in their practice than other schools? And is that leading to better student outcomes? And it's messy. We don't have a clear answer, which probably should surprise nobody. But there are certain kind of patterns that we see. So, for example, when it comes to schools that are improving their performance, we do see some interesting relationships where they're focused more on pedagogical practice. So it means that they're putting in place strategies that are building teachers' pedagogical repertoire or their pedagogical practice versus schools that are declining in their performance. Schools that are declining their performance are focusing more on building teachers, data capabilities and data literacy, for example. But that might be what's needed because the school has determined, well, we are declining in our performance, and we're looking at our performance of our students, and we're looking then at our teaching workforce as well, and we're understanding that our teachers may not have really strong capabilities to understand all the student assessment data that we have, and that if teachers can understand that data better and understand the assessment data better, then they can more precisely meet their students' learning needs. Whereas for those schools that are improving their performance, they're a bit more, they have more mature practices, so they're moving on to other areas of teachers' practice that are more suitable for their needs. So there is a tension there because of that complexity, and it is, of course, I think, driven by the demands of tests like NAPLAN, where we have committed to these education state targets to improve students' performance in the top two bands of reading and numeracy in Year 5 and Year 9, as measured by NAPLAN. We have committed to improving, or rather breaking the link between in disadvantaged schools, where we want to reduce the number of students who are performing in the bottom bands of NAPLAN in Year 5 and Year 9 as well. And I don't need to go into all the public and academic criticism there is of NAPLAN, but we recognize the limitations of NAPLAN, but it certainly does kind of play into that tension between practice and performance, particularly when performance is being measured by tools like NAPLAN, because inherently they don't capture the full complexity of schooling and of students and of their well-being, their engagement, their learning needs, and their learning growth either. So there's certainly a tension there that will probably remain unresolved for some time. In terms of the health and well-being aspect of it, as I said to you before, Babek, before we started our conversation, we're in an interesting point in FISO's journey. So last year we did refine the framework, and what we mainly achieved in the refinement was in the continua. So the continua actually used to look much more complex than it is now. It used to be much more comprehensive than actually it is now. So it still has the 4 priorities, it still has the 16 dimensions, but there used to be 53 descriptors of practice under it prior to 2020. Now you'll only find 29. So we reduced a lot of the complexity, a lot of the duplication across it, and tried to make it more accessible to schools and really tighten up the practices there. So that was a main thing that we refined last year. And then we've kind of shifted also the emphasis in the system from one of focusing more on what works. So very much when FISO was launched, it's supporting schools to focus on, what based on the research evidence works really well in improving students' outcomes. And now we're into a phase where we're focusing on helping schools implement that stuff really well and more effectively, because we can see that schools are focusing on the right things, but not necessarily implementing them effectively And so how can we support schools to do a better job at that, because they're not trying to change what they're doing, but just helping them to do it a little bit better. And now we're going to be entering a new phase, as you may have seen in the media reports and kind of coming through with the release of the Royal Commission into Victoria's mental health system, where education settings have been identified as like the ideal context for promoting student mental health and well-being, and a very clear recommendation that the highest unmet need in education is in primary and secondary schools. So we then looking back at FISO and thinking, okay, to what extent is FISO really promoting and has as its core student mental health and well-being? We also look at the lessons from 2020. Students spent on average 15 weeks learning from home last year in Victoria alone. And there was a lot of lessons from that for schools and for the department, particularly around the importance of student mental health and well-being, and what students were telling us and what teachers were telling us about the impact of last year and the importance of health and well-being as a co-driver of improvement alongside learning. So if we and then we look at the research evidence that was presented to us in the Royal Commission report as well, and I think we have a much better understanding of how well-being and learning can be integrated and can be co-drivers of school improvement. However, if you do look at FISO, I don't think it would be a surprise to anyone if you look at FISO, that mental health and well-being is not a core focus of FISO.
Yeah.
You look at the blue section, the excellence in teaching and learning, it's really weighted towards improving teachers' collaborative practices and particularly, their pedagogical curriculum and assessment practices, without, kind of clearly integrating and linking into what we know about the importance of mental health and well-being for students and teachers.
Yeah. And as you said, this is at the moment sort of under review in the work that you're doing with improving FISO, perhaps for addressing some of the issues.
Certainly thinking about it's not under review, but certainly thinking about the next phase of the work that we have to do as a system in terms of supporting school improvement. If the evidence is telling us about the importance of student and teacher mental health and well-being to achieving the learning goals that we want all our students to achieve and the excellence that we want them to strive towards, well then what does that mean for something like FISO?
Yes.
It's an open question at this stage, but certainly, like I said, you only need to look at FISO and you can start kind of thinking, okay, well, what would it look like if mental health and well-being was strengthened? How would that change FISO? Does FISO need changing? How would we go about doing that? Because we know when it comes to system reform from other jurisdictions, there's such a long tail, and change takes such a long time. And really, FISO's only been in place for 5 years, and that's not a very long time when it comes to school improvement.
No, like you said, I think school improvement is sort of a long and sustained practice. It takes quite a bit of time.
And it goes, it's like a EKG chart. It goes up and down like a school's improvement journey. You generally want it to trend in a upward trajectory, but it's not a linear upward trajectory. It will go up, it may dip down, it may drive up again and accelerate for a number of years. It may then dip down again. So it's certainly not linear either, which we recognize. And although FISO might not seem like it recognizes that on the surface, I think certainly in how we support schools to implement it, we have a deep acknowledgement of that. And from a policy perspective, that's why I think FISO has remained relatively unchanged over the past 5 years, and why during the refinement last year, we were really careful and considerate in how we refined it. And we worked really closely with school leaders and regional leaders in doing that work together, because again, wanting to maintain that ownership of the policy. Yes. and over time, try and get to that lofty goal of transferring policy ownership to to the user, to our schools and to our regions as well.
Yes. And I'm sure a lot of work has gone into it and will continue going into this policy framework. Thanks a lot, Brendan, for making the time for this conversation today.
You're welcome, Babak. Thank you very much.